ready, just let me know. Otherwise, I will start my 1AC now. I affirm resolve justice requires open borders for human migration. Before I proceed, I offer the following definition. An open border is a border that enables free movement of people between jurisdictions with no restrictions on movement. My value is justice, defined as giving each their due. A fair justice must strive to be available for all. Thus, my value criterion is mitigating structural oppression. Prefer this for two key reasons. First, mitigating structural oppression is crucial to ensure justice, as a true justice cannot be achieved if it is not available to everyone. Second, mitigating structural oppression precedes any other criterion because it is a route in which we ensure those criterions include everyone in the first place. Mitigating structural oppression must be kept in mind in both the processes as well as checked in the outcomes of various policies. This brings me straight to my contention 1, promoting opportunity. We are going to be talking about the lottery of birth. The lottery of birth philosophy states that the conditions in which we are born are uncontrollable by us. For example, we do not choose the environment we grow up in. This means arbitrary traits and factors we are born under, such as the color of our skin, should not determine our future. For example, if someone is born in Thailand into poverty but wishes to move to India because they believe they'll prosper economically there should be no forces restricting them from doing so. Thus, open borders are a prerequisite to justice because morally, they are the only way to allow people not to be bound by the lottery ticket that they receive at birth. I'm Rich 19 further explains, over the last 100 years, borders have come to function as a means of restricting the movements of the poor. Some of us are free to hop continents, suffering only the discomforts of economy seats. For the wealthy, open borders are already a reality. Others, who by accident of birth were deprived of the right brand of passports, die by the tens of thousands in the deserts and in the Mediterranean. Thousands more survive the journey only to be detained, caged, tortured, and starved, or dumped back where they started. Impact. Restricting opportunities is unjust. To truly achieve equality of opportunity and allow the least advantaged to be able to rise up in society, you must not limit them to the opportunities that they were given at birth. This reinforces cycles of oppression, so we need to have open borders to solve for this. Contention 2, brain gain. Allowing people more opportunities through open borders to migrate will increase education and skilled workers in their native countries. Theo Harrods and Abercard 21 proved by looking at healthcare. Notwithstanding the benefits of remittances and knowledge transfer, many fear that such migration weakens the provision of healthcare in the origin country. However, an alternative view is that opportunities for migration encourage investments in education and increase the supply of skilled workers in the home country, or brain gain, since not all newly educated workers can and will migrate. A comparative study in the Philippines examining brain drain versus brain gain, but there proves brain gain will occur. When the U.S. increased the amount of visas they gave out to the Philippines, those enrolled in U.S. nursing programs increased from 90,000 to 400,000. So many nurses took the nursing exam that for every nurse that moved abroad, 9 were licensed back in the Philippines. This shows that workers have proven to return along with their knowledge to benefit their native countries. Contention 2, border restrictions are harmful. There are two key reasons as to why borders are harmful to the least well off. First is climate migrants. Climate change is caused primarily by rich countries, yet has the largest effect in the developing world. Richie 19, the U.S. emitted more CO2 than any other country. It is responsible for 25% of historical emissions. India and Africa's contribution has been very small at 6%. The United Nations adds that the world's most vulnerable nations contribute the least to emissions, but they suffer disproportionately. Western nations such as the U.S. have a burden to help citizens outside of their own states because they are the ones making other nations face the consequences of their environmentally poor behavior. They have a moral obligation to leave their doors open to those that suffer because of their destruction. Open borders are the only way to do this. Lavelle 21, more than 200 million people are likely to migrate over the next 300 decades because of extreme weather events or the slow degradation of their environment. But international law has no clear mechanism to process, address, or facilitate climate migration. Past agreements such as the Paris Climate Agreement have proven that attempting to place quotas to allow more climate migrants have not worked. Open borders are the only solution. I'm Rich 19 adds that if we are to survive as a species, we must know that no boat can save us except the one we build together. And the United Nations further adds that climate change carries no passport and knows no national boundaries. Countries must work towards the common interest beyond narrow national interests. My second key point here is going to be on racist ideologies. Drake and Hiddleston 21 explain. The Border Patrol initially employed white supremacists, including Ku Klux Klan members from the outset, and its early history included regular beatings, shootings, and hangings of migrants. Border Control is the U.S.'s largest law enforcement agency with the least accountability, specifically targeting POC. Border racism has also been found in the Ukrainian border, in 26 EU member states, and many other borders. The restrictions in these borders are what cause racism. Tackling border racism will be done through opening borders because these racist restrictions would no longer be in place. Provine 13 explains how any form of restrictions would lead to discriminatory effects. Race and immigration law are perhaps inevitably intertwined. Over time, the role of race and racism in immigration law has changed. Laws that explicitly target particular groups for inclusion or exclusion can no longer be justified on eugenic grounds. Yet immigration laws and policies that leave room for race to play a significant role in enforcement are not only tolerated, but often embraced by immigration restrictionists. You have to be voting affirmative in today's debate because first, any movement should not be restricted. People have the human right to move, which is proven under the lottery birth theory. We tell you on the brain gain argument that people will come back and support their native countries, increase the benefits of education and economy overall. On the second contention, we tell you with the border, or the third contention with the border restrictions argument, we tell you that climate migrants people have the moral obligation to accept people that are facing the burden of climate change, and we tell you that any restrictions are going to lead to racist ideologies being inserted into them, which is inherently unjust. To actually mitigate structural oppression, you must vote on the affirmative side of today's debate. So thus I affirm, and I now open across. Opponent ready? Yeah.
Judges ready? Alright, then let's begin. Let's start with your value framework of mitigating structural violence. Are we prioritizing the least well off first in your value criteria?
Yeah.
Alright, and how do we know that structural violence is mitigated in the affirmative form? Like, where do we know that this has been achieved?
So how we evaluate mitigating structural violence is first by prioritizing those that are most oppressed and making sure that they are seen in policies and considered in policies first, but also looking at the consequences of those policies and seeing how they're affected once those policies have been enacted.
Alright, so if the policy ends up doing the reverse of structural violence, then it's inherently unjust, correct?
Yeah, but you also have to look at the principal part of that policy first, the processes.
Alright, so if the process in theory is just, but the outcome is not just, we should still prefer the policy?
We have to look at both the processes and the outcomes.
Alright, so we should look at the processes and the outcomes, but if something is still harmful to society, is that unjust?
Sure, if it's discriminatory, yeah, under our framework, that would be not good.
Awesome. Or you talk about on your contention one, the lottery for promoting opportunity. But if we have the opportunity to move, but someone is still least well off in their country, does this actually improve the least well off's quality of life?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because this argument is inherently saying that people have the inherent human right to move, right? So this means that they have to have no restrictions on movement, first of all. So this is more of a principle argument. And secondly, to acknowledge people that aren't actually able to move, first we have arguments like brain that improves their living conditions, but even then, if they're not able to move, that becomes an issue outside of this debate and is not the fault of open borders.
Awesome. So, but where does the impact come in? If we're decreasing poverty and decreasing the opportunity just by having open borders, then what does the affirmative, where's the link essentially? Is my question.
Wait, where's the link to decreasing poverty?
Yes, if we're having a lottery birth, we're not, we're not saying that people have an obligation to stay there, but if we're having the opportunity to move, what is the link to bettering their quality of life?
Okay, so the lottery of birth argument and the brain gain are kind of different. So to differentiate between the two, the lottery of birth just outlines that people have to have the basic freedom to move. That's inherent. People's arbitrary means that they were born under shouldn't affect their outcomes. But then the brain gain argument, if you're talking about that, is basically showing with the Philippines study especially that people are proven to return and bring their education back to a country which is going to benefit their native countries and provide knowledge transfer there.
Awesome. Let's talk about your climate change argument. Are you saying that people moving will help climate change or just help them move away from climate change?
I'm saying that to prioritize the least well off, we need to prioritize those that are facing the disproportionate impacts of climate change first, and then allow them to be able to move. Yeah.
Doesn't climate change affect everyone on the globe at the same time?
No, it disproportionately affects those in developing nations.
All right. And about these racist ideologies, are you saying that that with open borders, racist ideologies on borders will decrease?
Yeah, any restrictions will perpetuate racism. So without restrictions, that inherently shows that there's not going to be border racism, I guess.
Awesome. That's my information. I'll be taking a little bit of prep. Starting now. will be the negative case and the affirmative case. Are judges ready? Ready?
Yeah.
Alright, then let's begin. Today I negate the resolution resolved. Justice requires open borders for human migration. Today I offer the value of justice, defined as to each their due, leading me to my value criterion of security. Mabo 8 writes that security is a political principle with a primary function to guarantee national and international peace. Governments have the obligation to their citizens to be secure first, to give each citizen their due. Essentially, justice requires that a state must be secure first in terms of political process and the safety of their citizens. Contingent 1, increases trafficking and crime. The Schengen Agreement highlights problems with open border policy regarding trafficking. The Van Vollenhoven Institute writes that free movement in the Schengen area is a source of challenges. European member states face the challenge of transnational crime. Concerns about mobility have been present from the very start of the Schengen Agreement, with countries being weary of unwanted individuals, whether it be irregular migrants or criminals. The West Mediterranean route is increasingly chosen by migrants wanting to join Europe just to pursue the journey northwards. As a consequence, EU member states have to deal with the complex and intense migration flows. Migrants have a particularly vulnerable position and become easily clients of choice for smugglers and traffickers. The lack of knowledge on the overlap between these two complex phenomena not only hinder their understanding, but create substantial obstacles to combat the networks and actors involved in the business of trafficking and smuggling and to help those in need. In the status quo, undocumented immigrants pose a threat to security and justice. Hernandez 21 writes that smugglers try to avoid border patrol checkpoints using back roads, going off-road, crashing through ranch fences, and driving dangerously fast. Tiny law enforcement agencies act as a second layer of border enforcement apparatuses that tries to stop smugglers, drugs, and undocumented immigrants before they disappear into big cities. The impact is that people are moving. When analyzing the argument of trafficking, we need to understand that open borders would only increase the problems that we see in the status quo. Drug, human, and sex trafficking would see an increase. Furthermore, the harms would never be solved. The lack of checks allows for crime to be evaded in various different countries, leading to a lack of enforcement. Not only would the law be evaded and broken, but open borders harm the resources that are being utilized by law enforcement within different countries. Contingent 2, restrictive borders are better for justice. Justice does not require borders to be open all the time, nor to all people, specifically in the context of security. The subpoint A is national security. By allowing for checks to be eliminated in the name of free movement between states is not a risk that can and should not be taken. By allowing for checks to still occur, a restrictive border model is better for justice. Institute for Government 20 writes that border checks are required to ensure that any applicable tariffs or duties are paid and that imported goods meet the relevant standards in areas such as food and product safety and disease control to prevent smuggling and illicit activity, and to comply with international obligations. Gatekeeper Security 22 writes that border security is looked at as one of the most important aspects of security for many nations around the globe. Security checkpoints are usually some of the first places that security personnel and employees can stop potential threats or crime. Subpoint B is secure democracies. Limiting when and who can enter a country allows for democracies to be secure in terms of public services and servants to the public. Rebuttal 20 writes that America had an open immigration policy until the 1880s. Such a policy could never be reinstated in the modern era. What had changed was that public services had ballooned since the days of free immigration. The United States would be flooded by low-skilled immigrants from all over the world, straining the government's resources and forcing it to levy additional taxes to compensate. Thus, Friedman argued a country could either choose to have a generous welfare state or to open its borders to immigration, but not both. For open border policy to be executed, welfare systems cannot exist at the same time. Open border policy leads to politicians being less accountable to their elected democracy. Ansari 19 writes that the liberal perspective is that there is a moral responsibility to those outside of a nation's borders, may be admirable. But what is missing is the reality that the primary responsibility of elected political leaders is to voters inside the borders. The limits to open borders are partly a function of democracy. When allowing for borders to be open with no checks, it allows political leaders to not actually incite true and quality reform. This is not just. We see three clear harms. First, quality public welfare is sacrificed. Second, accountability is evaded by political leaders. And thirdly, an influx of crime within the state. It is for these reasons that I offer a negative ballot in today's debate. I'll now be moving on to the affirmative side of the flow. First, on the value debate, we can both achieve justice, so moving on to the value criterion. Firstly, my first response to this is if we have to prioritize the least well off, we need to look at their accessibility to move. So it is pertinent to this debate to see if the least well off can actually move, and we need to be prioritizing this, which my opponent conceded to in cross-examination, that we need to prioritize the least well off first. Secondly, this means that open borders are not open to everyone, which leads me to the contingent level debate of the lottery of birth. A couple main responses. First, moving to another country does not actually limit the poverty rate. Having the opportunity to move does not actually have a link or an impact to poverty. The impact weighs less in the affirmative world because the link cannot be accessed could not move in the first place. The card that I like to read is it will not help the poorest people who need it the most. Our NES22 writes that consequently, it is difficult to see how this can help the poorest people who lack the minimum resources and skills to migrate. Hence, the third premise is also controversial. So this will not actually be increasing their quality of life whatsoever, just have the opportunity to move because there's still a barrier, which means that open borders will not be a just world for society. Moving on to my second main argument, which was the brain game argument. Firstly, my opponent talks about remittances in this argument. Table 19 writes that remittances do not solve for structural harms. The remittance-based case for open borders fails to attend to systematic features of poorer states' institutions, such as enhanced corruption, that account for poverty and arrested rates of development. It essentially means that education can only go so far in structural systems, meaning that this point contradicts itself and the affirmative value criterion. Furthermore, it won't solve any of the economic harms that we see with corruption and poverty, which means that having the opportunity to move will actually not solve any economic inequalities. Moving on to my opponent's contention 2, or the third main argument, which was the racist ideologies. Firstly, the open border situation in Ukraine and concerning refugees, we actually see that racist ideologies are increased. Ray22 writes that there are many reports of black people being refused at border crossings in favor of white Ukrainians, leaving them stuck at borders for days in brutal conditions. What we actually see is with open border policies, there's actually an increase of racist ideologies and discrimination, which means we need to prefer the negative advocacy for restricted border policies. Moving on to my opponent's climate change argument, which they talk about how moving will essentially solve or decrease mitigating climate change or protect people. But what we need to look at this is climate change affects people all around the globe. And so moving is not going to actually do anything to help for climate change. So my opponent's impact weighs less on magnitude and less on scope. So we can see that for multiple reasons that the negative case is contradictory to mitigating structural violence, which means I urge a negative ballot in today's debate. Thank you. I now stand open for cross-examination.
All right. If anybody's not ready for cross, just let me know. Otherwise, I will start my time now. Okay, so starting on the idea of security. Can we agree that people are the least marginalized, like they tend to be the least secure?
Are you saying people in general? Is that like your
No,
question?
can we agree that like the marginalized tend to be the least secure?
Yeah, we could agree to that.
Does that mean that we should like lock every single marginalized person in a box to ensure they achieve the maximum security possible?
That is not what the negative advocacy. That essentially slims the negative advocacy to one solution. When we look at security that is framed in the negative world, we essentially see that they need to be secure in the political process to actually have anything to do with society. So that is the negative
what
advocacy.
extent of security do you want in your world?
Which is my contention too, which means that we should have restricted borders and border checks to allow for people
Yeah,
to
so I'm asking more about your framework. Sorry to cut you off, but what extent do you want security to be upheld at? Or is there no clear-cut extent that you want it at?
Yeah, on security, we see that it's obligatory to citizens first and to achieving international and national peace.
Okay, sure. So then let's talk about the idea that it's obligatory to citizens first.
Mhm.
So right now, countries like the United States are using national security as an excuse to place quotas on the amount of Muslims that can come into their country. Is this just in your framework?
Yeah, that assumes the status quo, and that is what the negative is not advocating for. So we see the contention too, which would advocate for a more just world and a more just framing for restricted border policies, which would not be putting a quota
How
on.
will you make these border policies more just?
Well, you can see that in my contention too, it would be essentially achieving the rate of how people come in and how quickly they come in. So it would not be putting a quota on a specific racial or ethnic group of people, it would be putting a quota on humans as a whole.
Okay, and how can you ensure that people won't put a quota on racial and ethnic groups and insert their racist ideologies, even if you're proposing that they won't?
We can propose many different theories, such as training and different things like that, but that's really not the negative advocacy to prove whatsoever.
Okay, and let's also talk about my framework for a bit.
Mhm.
You say that we need to look at the consequences. Is this your only response? You just agree to my framework too?
I agree to justice because it's the same, but the value criterion of mitigating structural violence I said was contradictory if people are not the least well off are not being able to be achieved, which means that accessibility is not being achieved, which means mitigating structural violence. And I also put the remittances argument against your value criterion.
Okay, sure. We can talk about that later then. Let's look at the contention too again. Have we ever seen any restrictive borders that actually don't insert racist ideologies into them in the status quo?
Can you clarify your question?
So we have conditional borders right now, right? Can you provide me one example of a conditional border that doesn't actually perpetuate racism, even if they propose that they won't?
Well, this is why the negative advocacy is different from affirming the status quo, because it would be a more just world than what the status quo is So that's what the negative advocacy essentially is for.
Okay, that's about cross, so I'll end it there. I'll just take running prep, so I'll let you guys know the time. I'll start that now. Okay, that was 3:15. You just write that down. So the order is just going to be framework side by side, app, then neg. Okay. If anybody's not ready, just let me know. Otherwise, I will start my time now. First, starting on the framework, it is a clear win for mitigating structural oppression over security. Let's start on the concept of security. First, they have no clear guidelines as to how much security they actually want. Let's go back to that example and analogy that we brought up in cross-examination. Intrinsically, to create the most amount of security possible, we would lock every single person up in this room into a box. But that is not inherently just, and that is actually perpetuating structural oppression, and we need to show, they don't actually show like where the limit is to how much security you actually want. But second, we tell you that security has been used in the past and right now as a tool to perpetuate racism. We show you that with our last contention on the racist ideologies point, that people use the guise of national security to basically like enforce things like quotas on the amount of people that a certain race can come into their country. But let's also look at the affirmative side of today's debate. Or on the affirmative criterion of mitigating structural oppression, they never respond to our warrants on how first, justice can't be achieved if it's not available for all, and second, how it precedes every other criterion because it's how we ensure they're included in the first place, so extend those. Now on the contention one about promoting opportunity. They say that people moving to another country doesn't have an impact on poverty. First of all, that's not the point. We don't even talk about poverty in this contention. We just talk about how borders are already open for the wealthy and that border restrictions are mostly for the poor right now. But secondly, they don't actually respond to the deontological part of this argument that just basically says that people have to have the human right, the basic human right to be able to leave their country. We tell you that that is an intrinsic human right, and arbitrary means should not restrict whether or not you're able to leave a place. That they don't ever respond to that, and that is a key part of this contention. And also, third of all, they say that moving to another country doesn't have an impact on poverty, but right now in the status quo, you can extend that Einrich 19 card. The borders are already open for the wealthy, so all we have to do is prove that only a few more people can be able to leave their country and our world to win this case. Now on the second contention about brain gain, they say that education can only go so far, yet proceed to drop my entire Philippines card that shows that education actually can go so far and bring people's education back to their country, on how healthcare workers, in the example, for every one that migrated, 9 came back. That's literally a real world example in a comparative study that looks at brain drain versus brain gain that shows that people will come back to their nations and bring education and allow those to prosper. So they don't ever respond to that intrinsic warrant, extend that. On the third contention, they say that moving won't do anything in response to climate refugees. Once again, they miss the entire point and core of this argument. This says first that countries have a moral obligation, if they're the ones causing destruction in other countries, to allow people to be able to have refuge in their countries. Second, we show that they don't help to solve for climate change either. At least we help to solve for the most urgent need. For example, if somebody is on fire and somebody is starving, you need to help the person that is on fire first, because that is the most urgent benefit that you need to provide to them, which is what the NEG can't help for either. But also on the idea about racist ideologies, they say that in Ukraine people are already are refused at open borders and they're not allowed entry. That is not an open border then. Remember my definition that goes uncontested in today's round. Open borders have zero restrictions. If people of certain colors are restricted in a Ukrainian border, that shows that that is not an open border. That would actually rather fall under a conditional border, which the negative side is advocating for. But let's show you why the negative side does not win this today's round on their own case. On the contention one about increasing trafficking and crime. First of all, this is non-unique. This will still happen in their world when they talk about how the migrants will come in and cause all of these issues. Second, we will still have law in our world. We're not trying to get rid of law systems altogether. There's already systems in place right now that if somebody commits crime in another country, that they will be sent back to the country that they were from. This is an intrinsic thing that shows that there will still be a state of justice. Third, the EU doesn't have openings for external borders, so they're not actually an adequate example of open borders. An open bordered world would mean every single border would be open, so don't buy their EU examples. Fourth, with open borders, there's no difference between immigrants and migrants, so don't buy their ideas that say that immigrants are going to commit more crime, because there would be no differentiation in a world with open borders where everyone can migrate. And this, and on the second contention, first, they never show you what it actually means to create border policies that are not racist. Extend Provide 13 that shows that any border policies will include and insert racist ideologies into them and force them to prove why they will not do this in their world. They don't outline this. This is why they will be perpetuating structural oppression and thus not fulfilling the burden of justice.
Alright, I'll be taking my remaining 40 seconds-ish of prep right now. The order will be the negative case, affirmative case, and then the vote case. Alright, judges ready? Opponent ready?
Yeah.
Alright, then let's begin. Let's start with the value debate of essentially security versus mitigating structural oppression. First, my opponent said that there's no bright line and we can lock everyone in a box. A couple main responses. First, this minimizes what security is in the negative world. In the negative world, I have outlined what security is within my value criterion of security with my conditional debate. Let's go over it one more time just for clarity. Security is essentially the political process that supports national and international peace, which means in my contention 2, which I outlined, secures democracies by having public welfare and accountability, which the bright line is going to the least well off too, and making sure that all people in society are secure, which means, leads me to my second main response. Secondly, my opponent brings up examples that restrictive borders in the status quo reaffirm racist ideologies. This reaffirms the status quo, which in cross-examination I already said was not reaffirming the status quo. Neither debater here is reaffirming the status quo whatsoever, so this burden goes back to the affirmative. Secondly, my opponent said that this will be increasing structural oppression, which again, this is reaffirming the status quo, which the negative is not doing whatsoever in this debate, which actually is decreasing structural oppression because there will be less crime, less trafficking, and it'll be easier to track. Furthermore, it'll actually mean that there will be quality welfare and quality reform in the negative world. So let's move on to the contentional debate. My opponent made a couple of main responses, which boils down to non-unique and look at having law. But first, let's look at the Schengen Agreement, which shows that it makes it harder with already an open border policy to track trafficking, and trafficking with law systems is already hard to track. So should we have more untrackable crime or less? It's the latter. Moving on, my opponent talks about, that's really their main response. So moving on to my contention 2, you can really extend most of this contention down the flow. My opponent says that I don't show border policies and that there will be racist ideologies. A couple main responses. First, in my last speech, I said that open border policies will lead to more racist ideologies. So it's the impact of who has more racist ideologies now, and the affirmative world does. Secondly, my opponent says that there will be more structural oppression, but I've already shown how there will be less structural oppression within the negative world. So you can extend that argument to my contention 2. Secondly, you can extend the Rebuttal 20 card, which shows that we should either have public welfare or open immigration, which essentially says that within America had an open immigration policy until the 1880s, such a policies could never be reinstated. If we want quality reform, we actually need to have not open immigration. So moving on to the affirmative side of the flow, a couple of main responses. First, on the value debate, what it comes down to is structure. By having open borders and opportunity, the affirmative does nothing for the structure of a society. Remember the Table 19 card and the remittance argument and the education argument, which I addressed in the first 1 and R. This is voter issue number 1. Alright, let's move on to the contentional level debate. My opponent brings this down to essentially saying, by having the opportunity to do something, this is good for society. But what this boils down to is by having the right to do something, if you cannot act on it, does nothing for society whatsoever. Which means that the affirmative's impacts lay way less in this debate whatsoever. Voter issue number 2. So you can extend all of these impacts, such as the RNES22 card, which says that it is difficult to see how this could help the poorest people who lack the minimum resources and skills to migrate in the first place. Secondly, my opponent cannot access this link and not talk about how these people who have the least well off can access this, which my opponent concedes to solving for this in their value criterion of mitigating structural oppression. Moving on to the second main argument of education in the Philippines evidence. Firstly, my opponent says I do not address this, but I specifically said in my 1 and R, education it only goes so far in terms of structural assistance, so you can extend this through the flow. Secondly, the Table 19 card showing that remittances do not solve for structural harms. My opponent's value criterion is specifically about structural harms. So if my opponent's case cannot solve for that, then extend that to the negative side of the flow. Secondly, on racist ideologies. First, the fair's main response is that this is supposed to be an open border situation. The fact that it was being racist and discrimination was being spewed was after the fact. Not that this was an open border, let's put the condition that we should not let black people in. That's not the condition. There was no conditions at all, which means that the Ray 22 card should be extended through the flow for the negative. Secondly, on the climate change argument. My opponent says that people should be, equally balancing the rate of climate change and moving people to better, and use an example of fire or starving. But this is not the same as what climate change is. My opponent says in cross-examination that climate change is affecting everyone. So if you're just moving people to a different country, that's not actually mitigating people's effect of climate change or actually mitigating climate change at all. So what we can see here is that climate change has no impact in the affirmative world whatsoever. So let's talk about a key main voter issue. Remember, voter issue number 1 is on structural violence, and that my opponent cannot actually solve for this. As we can see the Table 19 card, education goes so far in structural oppression, and furthermore, we can see that you can actually should prefer the negative, which shows that structural harms are actually reduced. Furthermore, we can look towards the actual solvency in the round, which is the second voter issue. That my opponent's burden that they brought up in this round by providing for the least well off is not actually solvable. But in the negative world, with restricted borders and a more just world, is actually better off because we can see an increase of trafficking and open border policies reduced by having it traced better, and furthermore by having better public welfare and better quality and more accountability of the political state, which goes back to my contention 2, which was very little unaddressed, so extend that through the flow. The third main voter issue is looking at what world is doing something better, which is the negative world in today's debate. Essentially, what we can see is if we are having better quality reform and better quality welfare, that means that the people who do get through those restrictive borders, we'll have a better quality of life. And that is the negative stance in today's debate. The affirmative cannot solve for any of those. Actually, we see that the impact of the quality of life will just reaffirm the status quo, which is not just whatsoever. By giving each person their due, by having restrictive borders, is actually a better life for all people. So it is for these reasons that I offer a negative ballot in today's debate. Thank you.
Alright. I have 45 seconds of prep left, so I'll take that starting now. Okay, so the order is just going to be framework side by side, and then voters. Okay, if anybody's not ready, just let me know. Otherwise, I will start my time now. Judge, mitigating structural oppression ought to be the thing that we prioritize in this round for a few reasons. First of all, extend how my opponent has dropped the framework warrants that we have provided, that our framework precedes any other criterion because it's how we ensure their criterions include everyone in the first place. And second, how justice cannot be achieved if it's not available for all. Because they have dropped this, they already lose the framework debate, but also, in addition, they say that in their world, the negative security is outlined and ensures that it will go to the least will opt, but we see in their world with conditional borders that it is not happening right now. And also, don't buy their argument, also going on to our first key voter in today's round. We're going to be splitting up the voters into why the affirmative wins the principle side of today's debate, as well as the practical. First, starting on the principle. We win on the argument of lottery of birth. Judge, extend how I said in my last speech on how they've never actually attacked the argument that there should be no restrictions on movement based of arbitrary means. The same way that the color of your skin should not determine what criminal sentence that you receive is the same way that the place where you were born should not determine where you should be able to go in the future. The negative says that people can leave right now, but remember our Irish ID card that currently says that borders are tools of oppression. Borders are already open for the wealthy right now. All we have to do is prove that a few more people can leave in our world to actually ensure that we win this argument. And we've already won the principle side because that was cold conceded. But secondly, we win the argument on the climate burden. Now, my opponent has never actually responded to the intrinsic warrants that says that when nations are causing destruction in other nations, it is their moral obligation to allow those citizens to seek refuge in their states with no restrictions. My opponent has never responded to this. They just keep on saying that there's going to, we don't actually help with climate change ourselves, but that is non-unique because neither do they. At least we actually help with the people that are suffering from it disproportionately, and then we can also solve for better policies in the long run. They don't help with this, prefer how we at least help refugees be able to get better conditions in the short term. But let's look at why we win on the practical arguments in today's round as well. First of all, we win on the argument about brain gain because we extend Theo Hardis and Abacard 21 that goes disproved and cold conceded, which completely says that Philippines shows that nurses came back into their countries to actually benefit their native countries. Every nurse that moved abroad, 9 came back to actually benefit the education in their countries. You can cold drop their card that basically just provides a blanket statement that education can only go so far, because this specifically proves that it can go more than so far and actually benefit native countries and benefit poverty and all of these other things in the long run. But the fourth reason, and the practical is on why we win today's round, is the biggest issue in today's round. If you're only listening to one voter, make sure you listen to this one. My opponent has cold conceded the Provine 13 card in today's round, which says that any restrictions in borders will inherently be racist. We've seen this in the past, that we have tried to implement policies that will allow for border restrictions to not encourage or not include racist ideologies into them, but they've already found their way in. This completely makes their second contention dropped because restrictive borders are not in fact better for justice if a true justice is mitigating structural oppression. This shows that we'll clearly win today's round because we make sure that policies are not only not restrictive, we make sure everybody has their means to be able to move and are not bound to the arbitrary decisions that they receive at birth, and that climate migrants get the justice that they deserve. For all of these reasons, it's a clear app ballot, and I urge you to vote on the affirmative side.